Audit of financial statement cycles. There are three types of financial statement cycle and related internal control, which is sales and collection cycle, purchases and payment cycle, and payroll and personnel cycle. Sales and collection cycles. There are two types of major classes of transaction, which is credit sales transaction and cash receipt transaction. This sales and collection cycle started when customer audit was received. Before auditor planning to audit their strategy, they should develop and understand the internal control structure. The auditor should control the environment, the information system, and control the procedures. There are 6 activities of sales and collection, which is receiving customer order, granting audit, prepares the sales order, shipping the goods, billing it to the customer, and collect and record the cash receipt, whether it in the form of mail receipt, cash sales, and cash deposit. There are 4 objectives and procedures, which is number 1, understand the entity and its environment. 2. Control the structure through cycles of activities. 3. To assess the effectiveness of the controls. 4. All sales transaction and receipt must meet the control objective. This shows the internal control objective and control procedures for sales transaction and cash receipt. In sales transaction, the occurrence for internal control objective is record sales for shipment and properly authorized. Meanwhile, for specific control procedures, it's supported by proper documents and obtained from the credit and collection personnel. Prepares and mail monthly customer statement. Completeness for internal control objective is all transaction is recorded. Meanwhile, specific control procedures, all the shipping documents and sales invoice must be pre-numbered checked by independent employee. The accuracy for internal control objective is all of the recorded sales must be from the good ship and correctly billed. Meanwhile, for specific control procedures is goods are counted and have been compared with sales order. Cut off for internal control objective is all sales are recorded at the proper accounting period. Meanwhile, for specific control procedures for invoicing and recorded sales as soon the transaction was effected. Classification for internal control objective is recorded in proper account, and specific control procedures, it must be reviewed for proper classification and had been coded by type of products. In cash receipt, the occurrence for internal control objective is record will be show the amounts that will receive from honest customer, and all written off will be authorized properly. Meanwhile, for specific control procedures, it should be separation of duties and there is an appropriate policies. Completeness for internal control objective is all cash received will be recorded in cash receipt journal. Meanwhile, for specific control procedures, adequate monitoring procedures must be maintained. The accuracy for internal control objective is record at proper amounts. Meanwhile, for specific control procedures, policies and procedures is provided to approve the receipt. Cut off for internal control objective is record at proper accounting period, and for specific control procedures, there is interval verification to compare entry dates and cash summaries date. Classification for internal control objective is recorded in proper amounts. Meanwhile, for specific control procedures, it is to ensure proper classification and review for unusual items. Purchases and payment cycle. The acquisition and payment function is similar to that for revenue and receipt, although more so for manufacturing and merchandising companies than for services companies. Purchase can be made in the case of credit basis. Subsequent payment for the goods and materials purchased involve an outflow of cash. The objective to auditor is to evaluate whether the account affected by the purchase of goods and services and the cash payment for those purchases are fairly presented in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. There are three activities of purchases and payment cycle, which is number 1, requisitioning goods and services. Initiated by requisitioning goods and services, there are 3 copies of form to ensure that no unauthorized purchases. First copy, it can be forwarded to the purchasing department. Second copy, filled in numerical sequence for future reference. Third copy goes to accounts payable department for future matching. The second activities of purchases and payment is preparing purchase order, multi-copy purchase order forms. First copy mailed to the vendor. Second copy goes to account payable department. Third copy to receiving department to alert the receiving clerk. Fourth copy goes to stores and compared with the original requisition. Fifth copy retaining in the purchasing department in an open order file. The third activity is receiving, inspecting, and storing goods. Receiving clerk will inspect the goods to ensure they are goods quality and consistent with the specification of order. Receiving report copy sent to the store department together with the goods, sent to the purchasing department to be compared with the purchase order, sent to the account payable department for matching with the copies of the purchase, filled numerically in the receiving department. The last activity is preparing payment vouchers and recording. Upon receipt, vendors' invoices are dispatched to the accounts payable department. Supporting documents are attached to a voucher which is approved and filed until the due date, forwarded to the cash disbursement section payment. A copy of voucher is sent to the general accounting for recording and posting to the account payables ledger. Checks and remittance advice are prepared and signed and mailed to the vendor, strictly controlled before mailing, and it will return to the account payable department and the voucher is filled numerically in a paid voucher file. It's sent to general accounting as a basis for preparing journal entries and posting to the account payable. This table shows the internal control operations and control procedures for purchase transaction and cash payments. In purchase transaction, the occurrence for internal control objective is it can be recorded purchases represent items actually required. Purchase transactions are properly authorized, preparing acquisition, ordering goods, receiving goods, and storing goods. Meanwhile, for specific control procedures, voucher it should be supported by proper documents, purchase order, receiving reports, and vendor's invoice. It also should be procedures for authorizing and approving requisition, purchase order, receipt of good, and transfer of good to inventory. The completeness for internal control objective is all sales transactions are recorded. Meanwhile, for specific control procedures, purchase order, receiving reports, and voucher should be pre-numbered. Copies of purchase order and receiving report should be forwarded to the accounting department to be matched with vendor invoice. The accuracy for internal control objective is purchases are recorded at the proper amount. Meanwhile, for specific control procedures, it should be procedures for independent internal verification of vendor invoice as to quantities received, price, terms, extensions, and footings. Cut-off for internal control objective is purchases are recorded in proper account period. Meanwhile, for specific control procedures, should be procedures for invoicing and recording sales as soon as the transaction is effected. Year-end purchases cut-off should be independently reviewed. The classifications for internal control objective is purchases are recorded in proper accounts. Meanwhile, for specific control procedures, purchases journal and general ledger should be reviewed. In cash payment, the occurrence for internal control objective is its recorded cash payments represent cash actually paid to vendors. The cash payments are properly authorized. For specific control procedures, it should be separation of duties between handling cash and record keeping. It should be procedure for approval of payment before signing of check by authorized persons. Completeness for internal control objective is all cash payments are properly recorded. Meanwhile, completeness for specific control procedures, it should be a system of review of any discrepancies in the procedures by a supervisor personnel. Accuracy and cut-off for internal control objective is cash payments are recorded at the proper amount and in proper accounting period. For specific control procedures, it should be internal verification comparing checks with payment records as to payee, amounts, and debt. Classification for internal control objective, cash payment are recorded in proper accounts. And for specific control procedures, account code on voucher should be reviewed. Payroll and personnel cycle is the third type of financial statement cycle and related internal control. It is important for auditor because of the relationship with a number of other accounts and activities in a firm. First, expense relating to wages and salaries. 2. The classification of and allocation of labor costs. 3. The operational level of a firm's activities. 4. Legal provisions. It begins with the hiring and placement of personnel, followed by the payment of compensation to employee, ended with the termination of employment. Obtained through a auditor previous experience. There are 4 activities of payroll and personnel cycle, which is number 1, authorizing employment. Personnel department is responsible for hiring, promotion, transfer, and termination of employees. It establishes procedures and policies with respect to hiring new employee. Personnel file contain records of employee. It updates for any changes in the pay rate, transfers, and promotion. Copy of the approved pay rate and authorized deduction should be transmitted to the payroll personnel. Number 2, timekeeping. It is important for employee that paid by hour. Punching of time cards. It is a good physical control measure because it is difficult to falsify the time punch. It is to prevent employees clocking in time card of absence or fictitious employee. Approved time card are sent to the payroll department. Number 3, preparation of payroll. Payroll department maintains an earning record for every employees that contain approved pay rate and authorized deduction. Provide the basis for the preparation of a paycheck for each employee. Payroll register and summary are first prepared to show the gross pay, deduction, and net pay. Checks, payroll register, payroll summary, and labor cost distribution records are sent to the accountant. It needs to prepare MPF contribution and file them to avoid penalty. Number 4, payment of payroll. Review the payroll register and signing payroll checks. Identification of employees is required when distributing the payroll. Payroll list or list of pay account detail should be prepared and reviewed before sending to banks. The transaction report from the bank should review for accuracy. This is the internal control objective and control procedures for payment of payroll. The occurrence in internal control objective is recorded payroll transaction for services performed by non-fictitious employee. Payroll transactions are properly authorized. And for control procedures, there should be segregation of duties of personnel, timekeeping, and payroll payments. There should be internal verification comparing payroll with termination list. For completeness in internal control objective, payroll transactions are properly recorded. And for control procedures, payroll check should be pre-numbered and accounted. The accuracy for internal control objective is payroll transactions are recorded at the proper amount. Meanwhile, for control procedures, there should be internal verification entries, including the review of approved rates and time cards. The cut-off for internal control objective is payroll transactions are recorded in the correct accounting period. Meanwhile, for control procedures, there should be procedures to compare dates on payroll check and entry dates in payroll register. The classification of internal control objective is payroll transactions are recorded in proper accounts. Meanwhile, for control procedures are classifying payroll costs should be reviewed. There are three components in financial statement cycle, which is sales and collection cycles, purchases and payment cycle, and payroll and personnel cycle. In sales and collection cycle, the cash receipt is related to the bank and account receivable. The business function is recording cash receipt, and it can be documents and record in cash receipt journal and cash receipt transaction. Sales return and allowance. It is related to sales return and allowance and account receivable. The business function is processing and recording sales return and allowance. It can be recorded in credit memo and sales return and allowance journal. Charge of uncollectible account is related to account receivable and allowance for uncollectible account. The business function is charging of uncollectible account receivable, and it can be recorded in uncollectible account authorized form and general journal. Bad debt expenses is related to bad debt expenses and allowable for uncollectible account. The business function is providing for bad debts, and it can be recorded in general journal. The purchases in purchases and payment cycle is related to inventory, PPE, prepaid expenses, leasehold, selling expenses, and account payable. The business function is processing purchase order, receiving goods and services, and recognizing the liabilities. It can be recorded in purchasing, requisition and order, receiving order, vendor's invoice, debit memo, voucher, account payable master file, and trial balance. Cash disbursement or payments in purchases and payment cycle is related in cash in bank, account payable, and purchase discount. The business function is processing and recording cash disbursement. It can be recorded in check, cash disbursement, transaction file, and listing. Payroll in payroll and personnel cycle is related to the payroll cash, payroll expenses account, payroll withholding account, and payroll accrual accounts. The business function is personnel and employment, can be recorded in personnel records, reduction authorization form, and rate authorization form. Timekeeping and payroll preparation can be recorded in time card, job time card, payroll transaction listing, payroll journal and listing, and payroll master file. Payment of payroll can be recorded in payroll check and payroll bank account reconciliation. Preparation of payroll tax return and payment of taxes can be recorded in the payroll tax.
Thank you for your attention.